welcome to this video on the lore of Conan Exiles. Now there's actually loads and loads of lore associated with the game, but unfortunately it's all scattered about the place. You pick it up on the lore stones that speak to you, and you hear it in the dialogue of main characters, and you find it in notes scattered about the place. But you pick it up gradually in bits and pieces, and it's quite difficult to actually figure out what's going on sometimes. So what I've attempted to do in this video is just put it all down in one place, just to give you an outline of the Exiled Lands, where they came from, who lives there, and what the history was. So we'll start with the first chapter of our story, and that's the continent of Hyboria and the Great Cataclysm. So this is the continent of Hyboria, but this Hyboria is one that's thousands of years older than the one we see in the Exiled Lands, and before it was ravaged by a seismic event known as the Great Cataclysm. If we look to the north, we see the land of Atlantis, and just to the south of that we see the Isles of the Picts. In the southeast is the archipelago of Lemuria, and Lemuria is very important to our story, as the Lemurians were the ancient peoples of the Exiled Lands, the ancient human inhabitants. And we can also take note of the land of Vlusia there in the west. Vlusia is important as it was the ancestral home of the Serpent Men, the children of Set. And the Serpent Men were the hereditary enemies of humankind, and all the races of man, like the Atlanteans and the Lemurians, were at war with them constantly, but they become important to our story a little later on. So the Great Cataclysm, when it struck, caused huge upheaval and turned the old continent of Hyboria into this. As you can see, it's a stark difference. If we look to the north, Atlantis has disappeared completely. The Isles of the Picts have become the Pictish Highlands, and Lemuria has been reduced to a single island on the east coast. The Cataclysm devastated all the lands of Hyboria, but it particularly affected the Lemurians, and the civilization of the Lemurians was pretty much destroyed. This forced them to flee west to the mainland, where they ended up in the land of Katai, where they were unfortunately enslaved by the inhabitants. The Lemurians stayed in Katai for many hundreds of years, until a second minor cataclysm gave them the chance to escape. And this cataclysm, this secondary cataclysm, also created the inland sea in the middle of the continent. So the Lemurians took their chance, broke free of Katai, headed west and crossed the inland sea to find the place that we now know as the Exiled Lands. So where exactly are the Exiled Lands? There are some who theorise that the Exiled Lands are a sorcerous realm, entirely detached from Hyboria, or is in fact some sort of dreamland. If you are to accept that the Exiled Lands are part of Hyboria, then there's really only one place that they can be, and that's on the northwest coast of the inland sea. This is the only place on the map of Hyboria that combines the various elements that make up the Exiled Lands. You have the mountains to the north, you have the river delta, you have the inland sea itself, a vast body of water, and to the south you have desert. And when the Lemurians arrived here, after crossing the inland sea, they found a land that wasn't entirely empty. They found it inhabited by a strange race, which they called the God Kings. All the evidence points to the God Kings being an alien race that was drawn to Earth in the distant past by powerful sorcery. They made the Exiled Lands their home, but they weren't the first to live there. But there were some ancient artifacts, like the Circle of Swords, that were built by races even older than they were. God Kings had created a powerful empire and a huge city, the Unnamed City, that was serviced by massive structures, such as the Great Aqueduct and the huge Northern Dam. But they took pity on the Lemurians who had washed up on their shore, and allowed them to settle in the eastern marshes, and found their city of Zel-Har. The God Kings were ruled by a triumvirate who had their seat in the Unnamed City. The triumvirate consisted of the Archivist, who was responsible for keeping the knowledge of the God Kings. Then there was the War Maker, who was responsible for the safety of the Empire. And lastly, there was the Priest King, who had dominion over the rituals of the God Kings. And it was the religion of the God Kings that caused a rift between them and the Lemurians, because as the Lemurians spread to the north into the cold lands, they made some rather unpleasant discoveries, specifically about the Serpent Men. The last we heard of the Serpent Men, they were living in their ancient land of Volusia, but the great cataclysm affected them as much as anyone else, and after many trials and tribulations, they were forced to retreat to a final stronghold, an extinct volcano known as Mount Vormithidreth. And I think there can be little doubt that this mountain stronghold is none other than our own Exiled Lands volcano. As the Lemurians spread north, they discovered the Serpent Men living under the volcano, and were horrified to find their ancestral enemies living so close to them. They were equally horrified to discover that the God Kings knew all about the Serpent Men, and were in fact their friends and allies. They asked the God Kings to turn on the Serpent Men and help destroy them, but the God Kings refused, and as a result the Lemurians declared war both on them and the Serpent Men, a conflict that eventually saw the destruction of not only the Serpent Men, but the civilization of the God Kings, and the destruction of the Lemurians themselves. The war was a protracted affair that led to the building of Zulan, a Lemurian citadel designed to keep the God King separated from their Serpent Men allies. The war lasted for many years, but the beginning of the end was the destruction of a God King army by the Witch Queen, the ruler of the Lemurians, using ancient, powerful magic. At a place that became known as the Shattered Springs, the Witch Queen blasted a God King army, destroying it utterly. Alarmed by this sudden and unexpected defeat, the God Kings turned to magic of their own. They unleashed a demon to carry a sandstorm that would obliterate the capital city of the Lemurians deep in the eastern swamps. This magic was foiled by a Lemurian priest called Petruso, who managed to halt the sandstorm at a temple now known as the Sand-Swept Ruins. However, the storm didn't just stop. It repeated itself endlessly, sweeping across the southern half of the Exiled Lands. This was the end of the Empire of the God Kings, as all the fertile lands that supported the unnamed city quickly withered to barren desert. The Triumvirate too was broken by the war. The Archivist was lured to a meeting with the Lemurians at the Circle of Swords, and was by his own account treacherously killed by the Witch Queen. The Priest King was also killed, in this case by his own son, Tyros the Deathbringer, a hybrid, half-human, half-god king who had fallen in love with the Witch Queen's daughter, Telith. Only the Warmaker Clyael survived that time, and he can still be found standing in the ruins of the unnamed city. So who is the Witch Queen? She was, or is, the ruler and chief priestess of the Lemurians, and it was she who led her people from the ruins of the Great Cataclysm to the mainland, and then onto the Exiled Lands. The Witch Queen is always referred to as a single entity, but it's not clear if she was an immortal being, or if Witch Queen is simply a title handed down from one generation to the next. There's a third possibility, in that the Witch Queen is an entity trapped in the mask of the Witch Queen. The mask is a powerful magic object that lets the Queen communicate with the god of the Lemurians, Dagon. If this is true, then anyone who wears the mask becomes the Witch Queen. This is the most likely explanation, as the mask does take over one of the characters in Conan Exiles, but we'll look at her story later on. The Ghost Wall is the defining feature of the Exiled Lands, as it entirely surrounds the old empire of the God Kings, and anyone wearing a slave bracelet will die if they try to cross it. There are two stories about the origin of the Ghost Wall. According to the Witch Queen, the bracelets were made by the Lemurians and the God Kings working together. The bracelets helped the two races to communicate with each other, and the Ghost Wall was created to give the bracelets power. However, when the war started, the God Kings changed the purpose of the bracelets and use them to turn the Exiled Lands into a prison. In another version of the bracelet's origin, they were created after the war began by the God Kings to keep their human servants and prisoners of war under control. There might have been elements of mind control in this scenario, as it would have kept the God King's prisoners weak and pliable. In either event, the outcome was the same. Anyone wearing a bracelet was trapped in the Exiled Lands till they died. The Exiled Lands are a wilderness. To the north and east are the ruins of the Lemurians. To the south, the massive stoneworks of the God Kings. All other habitations are the squalid camps of the exiled bands, the villages of the Vanir in the north, or the mud-built city of the treasure hunters in the west. Only one God King remains, the warmaker Clael, who stands alone in the ruins of the unnamed city. The Lemurians have vanished, either absorbed into the ranks of the newcomers, or have degenerated into imps, after long exposure to the corrosive magic of the God Kings. So where do these newcomers come from? Who are the exiles in the Exiled Lands? This story starts with a visitor to the ruins of the unnamed city, the sorcerer Thoth Amon. It's he who discovers the last of the God Kings and learns about the greatest artifact of their religion, the Serpent Ring of Set. Thoth Amon goes to find it, and evidently succeeds, as in all the Conan stories the Serpent Ring of Set is Thoth Amon's greatest source of power. Thoth Amon also apparently finds slave bracelets, and is able to copy them, because he hatches a scheme with the King of Stygia to make the Exiled Lands a private prison for the King's enemies. Anyone who displeases the King has a bracelet put on them and is dumped inside the Ghost Wall. Periodically, raiders provided by the King sweep through the Exiled Lands and ravage the exiles of any treasures they've managed to find. This is the origin of the Purge. The loot of the raiders furnishes the King with treasure and provides Thoth Amon with more magical artifacts. So that's the story of the Exiled Lands. The lands are a prison where criminals and undesirables are given a bracelet and dumped inside the Ghost Wall to be cheap labour. One example is Razma of Shem, the woman we see in the game's opening titles. Razma is a princess of Shem, who's abandoned in the Exiled Lands and left to die in a crucifix. Conan rescues her, but the two are separated in a sandstorm, after which Razma has to fend for herself. Eventually she makes her way to Sepamaru, where she joins other Shemite exiles, and they plan an expedition to the unnamed city, where Razma believes she will find a way to break the power of the bracelets. It's not clear what happens next, but somehow Razma ends up in the palace of the Witch Queen, wearing the Witch Queen's mask, and is taken over by the Queen's essence. The spell is only broken when the Witch Queen is defeated, and Razma somehow ends up back in Sepamaru. It's possible that Razma finds the mask on her expedition to the unnamed city, and under its influence she then makes her way to the Witch Queen's palace in the jungle. However, in the game the Witch Queen is killed by the player, which leaves us wondering how Razma was resurrected. One explanation is that Razma never leaves Sepamaru at all, but is somehow enchanted by the mask at a distance. On her journey through the Exiled Lands, Razma camps near the walls of the unnamed city and has a psychic experience in which she listens to the voices of the past. It's possible that the mask somehow influenced her at that time, and the fact that she's of royal blood might have made her a suitable conduit for the mask's powers. When the player fights the Witch Queen, perhaps he's just fighting a corpse that's been animated by the distant spirit of Razma. Anyway, on that note of speculation, we'll end the video. I hope you've enjoyed it, I hope you found it useful, and I hope to see you again soon.